On July 20th, 1969, American astronauts landed on the moon. Or did they? Despite the historic fanfare that surrounded the moment when Apollo 11 seemed to touch down on the lunar surface, it didn't take long for people to doubt that the moon landing had ever actually happened. Just 1 year after the moon landing, a group of roughly 1,000 Americans were polled about the event, and 30% expressed doubt that it had, in fact, taken place. Around the same time, Newsweek published a number of interviews with Americans who claimed that the moon landing had been staged in the desert, that it was simply not possible to transmit videos from the moon back to Earth. After all, they could hardly get some stations on their TVs. And that the moon landing had been faked to distract Americans from problems at home. Then, in 1976, a man named Bill Kaysing published a pamphlet entitled "We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle." Kaysing wasn't just a poll respondent or a random writer with strong opinions. He'd actually worked for a company called Rocketdyne, the NASA contractor that built the engines for the Apollo moon missions. Kaysing insisted that the moon landing must have been faked because NASA simply didn't have the technological capabilities to pull it off. And he claimed he could prove it. In his pamphlet, Kaysing pointed out so-called anomalies in the moon landing that included the lack of stars in the sky, the lack of a crater under the lunar module, and the fact that light and shadows seen in videos and stills from the moon landing, according to him, simply didn't make any sense. He claimed that NASA faked the rocket's takeoff and landing, then filmed the entire moon landing in a studio. And Kaysing was far from alone in his beliefs. Since 1969, a number of other theories about the moon landing have been put forward. Some have argued that the radiation in space would have killed the astronauts, while others have pointed to the American flag, suspiciously flapping without any wind. Meanwhile, some have questioned why missions to the moon suddenly stopped in the 1970s. Today, an estimated 5% of Americans strongly believe that the moon landing was faked, 6% somewhat believe it was faked, and 7% said that they don't know if it was faked or not. But what does the evidence say? You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Fraga.
And I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Austin Harvey.
Today, we're exploring the conspiracy theories claiming the 1969 moon landing was actually a hoax. Ooh,
spooky.
Yeah.
Not spooky, I guess. Not spooky.
Unless you think that aliens or ghosts were involved somehow, which...
True,
we'll get into that.
True. Or I guess the idea of the government lying to everybody is pretty spooky.
That's pretty spooky.
It's pretty spooky.
Yeah, so let's start with the moon landing, why it happened, kind of like that situation itself.
Why do we want to go to the big rock?
So in 1961, John F. Kennedy's the president, and he tells Congress, "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Less than a year later, he touches on this again, and he says, these are both very famous lines, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." So he's like setting up this as like this mission for the 1960s to go to the moon.
Right. Like it's like a challenge almost.
Like it's a challenge, yeah. So why did he want to do this? The answer goes back to the Cold War and specifically the space race, which is going on, have been like building the last couple of years. And it started in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. I used to do, in my period of pandemic unemployment, I did a podcast about travel history with a former colleague, and we covered Sputnik, and it was really interesting to learn just how like astonishing it was, not just for the world, but for Americans in particular, who were just like kind of horrified that the Soviets had beat them to this point, that they had done this, but it's a satellite into space.
Right.
So this starts the space race, and the U.S. creates NASA, and then from that point on, it's kind of a back and forth between who's putting who in space and these different accomplishments and everything. And in 1962, Project Apollo was formed by NASA to put a man on the moon. Now, there are lots of like false starts between that point and 1969, but let's jump forward then to July 16th, 1969. Apollo 11 takes off with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They enter into lunar orbit a few days later, and on July 20th, they touch down on the lunar surface. We've all seen the images of Armstrong. We've heard the audio that he says famously, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. This is amazing. Like, what an accomplishment.
Didn't he also say that he said one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind?
Oh, I don't know.
There's like discrepancy in what he said. Like, I think the quote most people think of is that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But he said that's one small step for a man. I don't know that it makes that much of a difference.
It kind of does. I mean, one's like a bit more poetic.
Yeah, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind is, I think, a little more poetic, like you said.
Yeah, I guess the quote I wrote down was a man. I said man though, without reading that part.
Yeah, see, maybe it's one of those Mandela effect things.
Yeah, maybe.
If we want to talk conspiracy theories.
The audio is like garbled. I mean, it is like from the moon, but
yeah, I just think it's an interesting point of note that he has been like, I'm pretty sure I said a man, and it's like, I don't know. I would just take the better quote. You know what I mean? I would just be like, yeah, that's definitely what I said.
Right. Yeah. But in any case, you know, these images and that the quote, whatever he said, is just like pretty astonishing. And in the next couple of years, there's 5 more lunar landings in 69, 71, and 72. No one's been back to the moon since then. And pretty soon after the last landing, these conspiracy theories about the moon start to, or not the moon, but the moon landing itself start to grow.
Oh, and probably about the moon.
And about the moon.
Yeah, probably about the moon, too.
I think it's an interesting point that I came across in my research that during this time, I mean, immediately after the moon landing, as I covered in the intro, like, people had some doubts. People thought it was sort of almost too amazing to be true.
Right.
But in the years after the moon landing, Americans' trust in government just plummeted. And there's a lot of reasons for this. You know, there's the JFK assassination, Vietnam War, Watergate. But just to throw some stats in there, in October 64, before the moon landing, 77% of Americans trusted the government. In 68, that was down to 62. In December 1970, 54%. 1980, 27%. Ooh. 2019, 19%.
Ooh, wow.
So it's been on a downward skid for quite some time.
I think that's fair, especially in more recent years. Not like even non-politically, you know, charged, whether or not you trust the government for political reasons. But there's like so much new information that they have actively released, right? The Freedom of Information Act. And then just like these revelations that, oh my God, there was so much stuff going on that we never heard about for years and years and years.
Behind the scenes.
Yeah. Relating to, you know, like UAPs or UFOs, whatever. Stuff like that, but also just like other investigations and war strategies and things like that obviously people wouldn't have been privy to, but now it's being made public. And so it's like retroactively, it's like, oh my God, what else are they hiding from us?
Right. Yeah. I think that's definitely a good point. I think like bigger things like Vietnam and Watergate, people were just going, what's like, you can't even trust the people in power.
Right. Whereas in those like post World War II periods, it was like, yeah, of course, like there was like a strong sense of like nationalism and, hey, we did it. America stepped in, they stepped up and they took down the Nazis. And
right. Plus there was this pressure of like, if you are not for America, then you're a communist and you're, you know, like evil.
Right. So I'd be curious to know how much of that was like actually people trusting the government or just saying they did because they were like, well, if I don't.
Yeah, well, that's a good point too. It's interesting as well. I mean, this is like a bit of a tangent, but like if you watch the debate between Kennedy and Nixon in 1960, they agree on like almost everything. They're trying to outdo each other on communism, but they really don't. Like in today's debates, people have gotten further away from each other. And that's because, you know, these social issues became more part of the political conversation than they were in 1960.
Right.
But at the time, it was like you were either like against communism or like really, really against communism. And that was sort of like
right.
the barometer. But anyway, so this distrust in government is growing. And then in 1976, this guy named Bill Casing publishes a pamphlet saying, it's called "We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle."
Yeah. Was the pamphlet the podcast of its day? Today you would do that on a podcast. Maybe in the 90s it would have been like a radio show, like Coast to Coast. Back in the 1970s, it was like, how do I get this word out? I know, I'll publish a pamphlet.
Yeah, why not?
Hand it out to people.
That's what he did, and that was like the first like there were doubts out there, but he was the first one to kind of put it to paper. And, he had worked for this company called Rocketdyne, which was a NASA contractor. So he seemed like someone who knew what he was talking about.
Right.
So he was the first one. After him, lots of other people have also published stuff. And of course, there's like 10 million videos on YouTube or TikTok or something, I'm sure, about the moon landing. So these are kind of like the top conspiracy theories. We're just going to go through them and discuss what they say and kind of what the experts say back to them. The first is that in these photos and images of the moon landing, there's no stars.
Sure.
And people say there's no light pollution on the moon. There should be millions of stars. And they take this as proof that the whole thing was staged. The answer, which I think is kind of interesting, is that it's daytime on the moon. So everything's kind of lit up by the sun.
Right, because they weren't on the dark side.
Yeah. Plus, the exposure on the astronaut's camera was too short to capture any like very faint stars. One person compared it to going outside and standing under a street light and taking a picture because you won't see the stars behind the light of the street light.
Yeah.
So that's that one. Bunk or debunked, I guess.
We've bunked it. Is bunking it proving it? Is that what?
Well, it's funny because you say that's bunk or you debunk something. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So you debunk it means you prove it to be false.
You debunk that bunk.
Oh, wow.
So that's the first theory. Another one is that, Earth is surrounded by this radiation belt called the Van Allen belt, Allen. Van Allen twice. Van Allen. My heat stroke. And this theory says that if the astronauts had passed through this belt in real life, they would have been like fried because it's so intense.
Ah, right. Okay.
In fact, if you go through it fast enough, which they would have to get to the moon, it wouldn't affect them. It wouldn't be like dangerous.
Yeah, there's no prolonged exposure to it.
Yeah.
Because that's what radiation does, right? It's not instant death radiation.
Yeah. It's like it depends on the how long it's sustained,
Right.
Yeah. Someone in an article compared it to like walking over hot coals. Like if you stand on the hot coals, that's going to hurt. But if you run across the coals, like it'll sting, but like you're fine.
Yeah, or like being on a hot beach even, where it's just like right.
Don't stand on the hot thing. People say that, moving on to the next one, people say that it's possible to see certain objects even though they're in shadow, which means that the moon landing must have been filmed in a studio because there's multiple like lights in a studio. Plus the shadows and certain images don't look parallel, so this must have been created by studio lighting. But there was the sun that was like one source of light, but there was also this reflective lunar surface, which was casting light as well.
Right.
And non-parallel shadows also exist on Earth. So it's like not really that good of a theory, actually.
Right.
One of Casing's points was that there was no crater beneath the lunar module. And if it landed down, it would have like created this whole crater on the moon. But experts say, actually, no. The engine of the module is powerful, but it does most of its work kind of like above the place it's landing. And then it sort of like touches down more softly, I guess. And the impact would have been
propels
to the side.
itself there, and then it just kind of floats down.
Yeah, so that it makes sense that there wouldn't be a crater. The next one is the one that I first heard when I was a kid that we touched on last time, which is that the American flag in the pictures seems like it's waving. And people were like, well, how could that be possible? There's, no wind. If you look at the picture, you can see that the astronauts put like a pole on top of the flag just to hold it up into place. And it's crumpled from the journey, so it looks like it's waving, which I was like, oh, that makes sense because they wouldn't like hang it, and there's no room in the spaceship.
Right.
So
And there's also like just they raised it up on the pole, so there's just that like there'd still be like momentum of it if you capture the picture at the right time. It'd be kind of you want the picture to look dramatic like that. You don't want the picture to just be this limp flag.
Well, especially since it's this very triumphant, like, we beat you, Soviets, to the moon. You want the flag to look like a flag. But I think that's kind of probably the most well-known and interesting one. People have said, why have we not gone back since the 1970s? And conspiracy theorists will say, well, we haven't gone back because we never went in the first place. And anything that happened after the initial moon landing was faked just to make money for NASA and the aerospace industry. In fact, it's a bit more complicated than that. The space race sort of cooled down. The Cold War heated up elsewhere. And in recent decades, the focus has been more on the space shuttle program, the International Space Station, versus going to the moon.
Yeah, because there's really nothing else to find on the moon. I mean, as far as we know, right?
I mean, just been other priorities, and it is expensive.
Yeah.
And another thing Casing said was that NASA just didn't have the technology to go to the moon. He said it's well documented that NASA was poorly managed, had poor quality control. but suddenly they could do this successfully? Like, no way. And the answer is that, like, yeah, it was unlikely, but NASA was consuming 4% of the US budget in the mid 60s, which is like a lot of money.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, this would just be a really, really, really hard thing to keep secret because there's so many people involved on so many levels. And to like get them all to stay quiet is just unlikely. And so, like, yeah, this one comes back to what Kennedy says is like, you know, we didn't do this because it's easy. It was hard. It was a challenge.
Right.
And
yeah. That's kind of why it was such a big deal.
yeah.
Like, you can't really debunk something by just being like, or like, you can't claim something to be false based on the grounds that it would be difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If it was something that was like actually impossible, that's another thing. Like a person just flying, right? Like that would be more like worthy of garnering skepticism because it's like, well, scientifically, a person cannot just fly. So what's going on here? But it's like, no, it was scientifically possible to go to the moon. Very difficult. But the fact that it was very difficult is not a solid argument for suggesting that it was not true.
Right. I mean, it's like any technology, I think when it first happened sort of seems impossible. The telephone,
I mean, think about
camera.
Like, I was going to say the telephone, or when they debuted the first iPhone and it was like, look at what this can do.
Yeah.
It's a landmark
It's
moment.
amazing. I mean, I don't understand how any of that technology works, but it does. Other theories people have like kicked around are that Armstrong doesn't appear to be holding a camera, but the camera was actually like on the front of his suit. So that solves that one.
Because it'd be very hard to hold and work a camera.
Yeah. And it kind of makes more sense to have the camera on your suit as well.
So you can't lose it.
Yeah.
Off in space. There it goes. Glad we made it. We have no way to show we made it.
Wouldn't that be something if like decades later it like floats back to Earth, all the pictures?
Oh, wow.
And then some believe that Stanley Kubrick filmed the whole thing. But I guess the argument against this, which maybe isn't that strong of an argument depending on your opinions, but it's that 2001: A Space Odyssey just doesn't look as realistic as the moon landing does. So if he couldn't pull it off, then...
Yeah.
Those are kind of like the main points and the main rebuttals. Are you convinced that the moon landing happened, or what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, no, I think it happened for sure. I like to think of this one as like baby's first conspiracy theory. As someone who's looked a lot into conspiracy theories and like the layers and the mental gymnastics you have to do to like buy into some of these other conspiracy theories, it's like, whoa, like flat earth theory is like you got to do a lot of mental gymnastics to convince yourself that what you're reading is the truth when you're trying to like buy into that theory. I think this one sort of functions as like I'm going to say it's a gateway into conspiracy theories, but in the same way that DARE officers told us that marijuana was a gateway drug, where it's like that's kind of been proven to not be true. Like just because somebody smokes weed, it doesn't mean they're going to do methamphetamines or like heroin or whatever, because they're just fundamentally like different in whatever. This is kind of the gateway conspiracy theory where it's like there's enough there where you can be like, well, you know, the US was really worried about Russia getting there first. So you could logically reason maybe they would lie, maybe they would fake the footage and fake the photographs to make it seem like they made it there first, because that would be a victory for America over Russia. Mm-hmm. But then you start to actually look into it, and like it's very clear that like, oh no, like they did it. They went there. Like there's enough testimony, there's enough like historical evidence and behind the scenes information that then became public, documentation about how the shuttles were built and like the training they went through, things like that.
Yeah. Plus it happened like multiple times after that. So that just kind of expands this conspiracy then to all those people also.
Right. That's where you start having to like really stretch and be like, oh, well, they kept faking it. It's like, well, what about the ones that blew up and people died? Did they fake that?
Right.
So
yeah, it's a good point too.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it just is like I guess it's a good litmus test for like the kind of person you're dealing with. If in conversation they start ranting that the moon landing was faked, it's like, all right, well, that's kind of the easiest one to disprove. So I should be careful what else I bring up in this conversation now.
Interesting. Yeah.
The litmus test for like a reasonable mind, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that I think I don't believe the conspiracy theories, but I think what's interesting about this story is just the history behind it, not only why it happened, but then why people had stopped believing in it, even in like small numbers. And the numbers like aren't big of like who believes that it's faked. I mean, they're there, which is something, but just this idea that like maybe that coincided with this distrust in government and these like bigger like historical and political trends that were going on, I find interesting.
Right. And I think there's also, we covered, I think, some of the more reasonable conspiracy theories, or just like it's all one conspiracy theory, right? It's they fake the moon landing, and here's like little bits of evidence, or like, what people claim to be evidence, like, oh, the shadows, the flag, all of this stuff, but it's still tied to one central conspiracy theory. There are also like probably a million other ones about the moon that like we couldn't even possibly get into, like, what if they found aliens on the dark side of the moon, and that's why we haven't gone back?
Yeah, that one's out there too.
Yeah, and it's like, well, one, the dark side of the moon, correct me if I'm wrong, changes, right?
I think so. It's like Earth.
Because the moon rotates and spins on its axis. So there's not a dark side of the moon. It's just whatever one we're not looking at.
Well, there you have it.
Yeah, I'll leave it at, no, I'm not convinced that the moon landing was faked.
Yeah, I'm also not convinced. I think that there's enough evidence, and the evidence against it just doesn't really, it seems too easy to debunk. So
yeah, no one's ever come forward with like really good evidence. Like no one's ever been like, oh, I found leaked government files that they faked it.
Yeah.
It's always just someone pointing to the stuff that's already out there and going like, oh, but the shadows are weird or whatever. It's like, no, well, all right.
A couple of years ago, some conspiracy theorist went up to Buzz Aldrin and was like, it was faked. And he punched him in the face. Buzz Aldrin punched the guy. And he's old too. Like,
Yeah. And the funny thing is that's not even the most egregious thing a conspiracy theorist has ever said to somebody involved in like the central. It's ridiculous to go up to the guy who was on the moon and tell him that it was fake. It's another thing to tell parents whose children were killed at Sandy Hook that that didn't happen. But it is this kind of like somewhat dangerous pipeline, which is why I was saying like the litmus test thing, because it's like if you're talking to somebody who believes the moon landing is fake still in 2024, maybe just to cut that conversation short, because...
Yeah. But it's interesting, though, because if you believe that now, I think you'll find more people who agree with you online than you ever would in the past. So, like, if you have these theories, it's pretty... You could believe that maybe by yourself or in a small group in the 70s, but now... could find a Reddit thread with like thousands of followers. Yeah.
And that's what and then you find somebody talking about the moon landing, and then they're like, well, did you also hear about this other thing? And you're like, what is that? Oh no.
Yeah, right. That concludes the first part of the episode. And I guess as we've been doing lately, the second part, we're doing kind of an abbreviated history happy hour for members, getting into some news articles and some historical anniversaries for June.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed that first part of the episode and you're not a member and you want to become a member to get the second little segment we're doing here, you can head on over to allit'sinteresting.com/membership and join for just $5 a month. Comes with a few other perks as well. And it, helps us out with a little bit of extra support there to make the show. Otherwise, if you have your own thoughts about the moon landing and you want to let us know, you send an email over to podcast@allthat'sinteresting.com. Let us know your thoughts on this, or if there's anything we missed, possibly.
Yeah, we love to hear that.
Not to dunk on your research abilities or anything.
No, there's a lot out there, and this is a kind of a skimming the most, popular theories and stuff. But you can email us. You can leave us a voicemail, 929-526-3029. We do listen to those. We appreciate getting them. So, yeah, I guess our next show is the JFK Jr. one, speaking of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, the plane crash that JFK Jr. was involved in.
Yes. I have written 2 articles about it, so taking the lead on that one.
Yeah, another victim of the Kennedy family curse.
Exactly, yeah.
And then after that, we'll be talking about Balto.
Which is a bit, lighter.
Yeah.
Although there is some controversy about Balto, too.
Is there
Yes.
Balto's controversial?
His trainer, kind of. We'll get into it, but his trainer had some sort of negative things to say about Balto.
Oh no!
After his famous feats.
Wow, that is okay. Yeah, I guess we'll get into that. So maybe not quite as wholesome as we were hoping, huh?
It's still wholesome, but there's just controversy. I learned that writing about famous dogs at one point. But yeah, some exciting stuff coming down. Boy, why do I say that every single time?
Coming down the pipeline.
Yeah. Some exciting stuff on the calendar moving forward. But yeah, you can, if you're dying for more content in between podcasts, you can always check out the site. We publish there every day, all the time.
Every single day.
Every single day, new stuff. Yeah. And then, as we said before, feel free to send us an email, leave us a voicemail.
Yeah. Check us out on social media
Yes.
at History Uncovered Podcast on Instagram, at Real History Uncovered on TikTok, and on YouTube, where you might be listening to this already, in which case, never mind.
There you go. Yeah. I always forget about YouTube. Yeah. And then we'll be back with JFK Jr.'s plane crash in a few weeks.
Until then, don't trust your government.